we're here to talk about unlocking the value of community scale storage for consumers. So thanks everyone for joining us. We're really excited to spend a bit of time today talking about community scale storage. So Energy Consumers Australia, a number of months or even more than a year ago, hired the Brattle Group to do some analysis and look into the opportunities and challenges around community scale storage in Australia. And so we wanted to take some time today to explore that topic and share the research and have a bit of a discussion about community scale storage. So, so we're here today to talk about community resources that in part can help us keep the environment clean. And so, the traditional owners of our lands have a lot to teach us about both community and keeping the environment clean. So before we go any further, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today. I'm here in Mullumbimba, the place of the Sea Ferns, which is the traditional name for Newcastle. The Wabakal people are the traditional owners of these lands, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. I would also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where you all are coming from. Okay, so we'll have Ryan Hledik join in just a second to share the full Brattle report. But if something pulls you away, the main takeaways from that report really are on the screen here, which is, and some of these are broader than just community scale resources. But if we want community scale storage to work for consumers, there's kind of three main things that we identified. There's more than that, but the three key takeaways are that we want to reward small scale resources, including community scale batteries, for the value that they provide the system. We want to make sure that the second one is make sure that network data about where the best opportunities in the network for community scale batteries, but also all sorts of consumer energy resources, better and more information to all stakeholders about where those opportunities lie. And then last but not least, we need to reduce the cost of community scale batteries. So if we can do all of those three things, we think we'd be in good position to really unlock the value of community scale storage for consumers. So you can see the agenda here. I'm not going to talk too much longer. I'll pass it to Ryan. He'll give an overview of the research that they did for us, and then we'll open it up to a panel discussion where Ryan will be joined by Marnie Shaw from ANU and Tristan Edis from Green Energy Markets, and it should be a really lively discussion. We all have our own perspective on community scale storage. I think it's safe to say Tristan's sort of a known pessimist when it comes, or skeptic when it comes to community scale storage. So that's good. We wanted to highlight the diversity of thought on this topic, and we'll make sure to take plenty of time for your questions. And then we should close at 9. If there seems like enough interest, we might go a bit longer. Okay, so just quickly about community scale storage. So I think this will come through in Ryan's discussion a little bit, but there's this idea, as you would all know from fairy tales, about the Goldilocks principle, which applies now. People have used it to apply sort of across the arts and sciences. And so, right, you remember Goldilocks didn't want the small bed, didn't want the biggest bed. She wanted the bed in the middle that was just right. And you see this concept sort of emerge over and over again. So in child psychology, we learn that kids prefer activities that aren't too simple, but they're not too complex either. When my kid was learning to write, we were always talking about just right books, which would be like a Goldilocks book. Astrophysicists, when they're looking for life outside of the solar system, they look for planets in the Goldilocks zone, which is not too far away from their star, but not too close either. But basically, so the temperature's right for liquid water. Even economists talk about a Goldilocks economy that sustains moderate growth with low inflation. Remember that, and a Goldilocks market that sits somewhere between a bear and a bull. And so the question for us really is, are community scale batteries another example of this Goldilocks principle, where they're kind of small enough to benefit the distribution system, but big enough to deliver benefits for multiple customers. This nice sort of in between, this just right in between phase between large transmission scaled batteries and household batteries. The big question really is whether or not the cost is effective. So the last slide for me, I just wanted to acknowledge really the fact that Australia has placed a fairly large bet on community scale batteries. We're starting to talk about real money here. It was $250 million approximately from Commonwealth and state funding. I think I got everything, not sure. Obviously the biggest chunk of funding is from the Commonwealth. That was a total of $200 million for 400 batteries. 58 of those batteries went out, sorry for the alphabet soup here, but went out through the Department of Industry, Science and Resources, or DICER. Those batteries kind of were funded straight away shortly after the election, I think in early 2022. And then ARENA has the other $171 million to allocate to build at least 342 additional batteries. I don't think they've completed the funding on any of those, although they're quite advanced for the first round of funding. The first round was $120 million. And there was more than 10 times that much amount of requests for community batteries. So $1.3 billion in applications came to ARENA. So basically, there's a ton of appetite and interest within communities and distribution networks to build these batteries. And I should have mentioned that from ARENA, that in that grant round, at least, the expectation is that 50% of the funding will go to DNSPs and 50% to non-DNSPs. DNSPs are the distribution network service providers, the local poles and wires businesses. There's also been a lot of state funding, principally in Victoria. Victoria did this thing called the Neighborhood Battery Initiative. That was about $11 million in funding. They did 28 projects. Some were batteries, some were feasibility studies for neighborhood batteries. They're now focused on the 100 battery or 100 neighborhood battery initiative, where they're going to build 100 neighborhood batteries. So they've already funded 25 of those at $300,000 each. So ballpark the guess, then my guess is that that's a total of $30 million of funding. And then, not to be outdone, in WA, Synergy, which is the state-owned retailer, has built at least 13 community scale batteries. Many of those had an innovative virtual solar storage approach, where residential customers could sort of store their solar energy. They weren't physically storing it. They were virtually storing it. Anyway, so there's been a fair amount of trialing going around, and in light of that trialing and the amount of money that government put into this, Energy Consumers Australia was basically curious about, like, is this a good idea? And how do we make sure that community scale batteries deliver for customers? So we made the decision to do some research on that, and we were very lucky to be able to hire the Brattle Group and Ryan Hledik. So I'll ask Ryan to join us. So I've known Ryan for a while. He's consulted for more than 80 clients across 35 states in the US and 9 countries. His work has been cited in regulatory decisions on all sorts of things: energy storage, demand response. He's helped authorize billions of dollars in smart metering investments. He co-authored Saudi Arabia's first demand-side management plan, and in the US, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the FERC, he authored a landmark study that they published called A National Assessment of Demand Response Potential. He's been published in all sorts of popular publications that you would recognize. He has a lot to say, not just about community scale storage, but all sorts of consumer energy resources. We're very lucky to have him. Ryan.
Well, Brian, thanks very much for that introduction. And are you seeing the slides? Are they up on your screen now? Thumbs up?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, thank you for that introduction. I want to start by really quickly thanking Energy Consumers Australia and Brian Spack and his colleague Carol Valente in particular I look back, we actually started looking into community scale storage with ECA nearly 2 years ago. And obviously a lot has changed both with respect to community scale storage and with respect to the Australian energy market more broadly in the 2 years that have elapsed. So, kind of adding to some of Brian's introductory comments about the purpose of this study and our objectives, I also really just want to emphasize that this is really intended to be kind of the beginning of a conversation as opposed to presenting what we consider to be the final answer on community batteries in Australia. I'm going to move pretty quickly here and just focus on the highlights. I promised Brian that I wouldn't take more than 20 minutes. That means that I had to cut out all of the gratuitous references to Bluey, one of Australia's greatest exports, and a TV show that my kids are very fond of here in the States, but maybe we can get to some of that during the Q&A. Okay, so the scope of the study. What did we set out to do here? Few purposes to our study. We just generally want to highlight the critical role that energy storage will play in Australia's power system. We wanted to explore the relative advantages and disadvantages of different types of storage projects and talk more about that in a second. We also wanted to identify some of the challenges and barriers that could prevent community scale storage projects from fully realizing their benefits, and then talk about opportunities or ways that we can address those barriers so that the value of community scale storage is maximized for consumers, given the growing policy focus on promoting community storage projects. We're really focused on trying to understand how we can make the most out of this initiative that is already underway. So with that said, there are also some things that our study doesn't do, and we want to be clear about that. The first is we're not coming in to advocate for community scale storage as the uniformly preferred form of energy storage in Australia. Really what we're talking about is trying to optimize and maximize its benefits. We don't propose specific ownership models or business models related to community scale storage or who should be owning the batteries. We're not determining the viability of, this isn't about assessing any individual battery project. Our analysis is based, as you'll see, on average costs and system conditions. We also, with the perspective that we're taking in this study, just want to be clear that we aren't assessing the economics of household battery ownership from the perspective of the consumer. What we're doing is we're taking a power system level perspective on both the costs and the potential benefits of these projects. And then lastly, what we're doing here is we're not attempting to indicate the overall cost effectiveness of these projects. What we're really trying to do is understand the relative economic advantages and disadvantages of different storage project types. So with those, I guess, caveats out of the way, we'll quickly move into our quantitative analysis for this project. So as I just mentioned, we used a societal or system level perspective on costs and benefits to understand the relative advantages of each option. And we looked at 3 different types of storage projects in this analysis. So first is household storage. Here, what we're talking about are maybe 5 to 30 kilowatt hour batteries that are located on site or behind the meter of individual homes. Typically these batteries are being deployed to provide backup power to those homes, or to improve the value of rooftop solar, so that they can be operated to provide energy system benefits as well. Community scale storage, imagine everyone's pretty familiar with this concept already. We're talking about mid-sized batteries. What we're seeing on this slide using very round numbers is maybe roughly 100 to 1,000 kilowatt hours of storage capacity. Those are rough numbers. I actually think we may want to think about the definition as including batteries that are larger than that. But these are batteries that are connected to the distribution system. So they could be deployed to serve downstream local communities and also to provide services in the other direction to the broader upstream energy system. These are community scale batteries, but as I was saying, they could be sponsored or owned by any entity. We're not taking a position on that in this study. And then lastly, we get to transmission scale storage. These are large scale, maybe 100 to 1,000 megawatt hour transmission connected batteries that are really largely being used to provide bulk system value by participating in wholesale energy and ancillary services markets. So what do the high-level economics look like for these three project types? We're starting with household batteries. And what you're seeing in the chart below is our estimate of both the annual benefits in terms of dollars per kilowatt year and the costs in those same units of an average household battery from the perspective of the power system. So the blue section of the bar that you're seeing, that is the energy value that could be provided by charging and discharging the battery in a way that provides energy value in the NEM, in the energy market. And we simulated the dispatch of all of these battery types, assuming some degree of imperfect foresight into future energy market prices. So we aren't assuming that an operator of the battery has the perfect ability to forecast and predict how 5-minute energy prices are going to evolve in the future. Local reliability, that represents the value to the participant or the owner from avoiding distribution level outages and using the battery for backup power or essentially as a microgrid. And then the yellow section represents the cost savings that could be associated with avoiding or deferring upgrades to the distribution system that would result from instead reducing customers' demand and serving load from the battery rather than building out the distribution system to serve all of that customer's peak demand from the broader grid. So you can see that the way we've modeled household batteries involves stacking those different sources of benefits. You stack all of those up, and we're estimating a benefit of a little under $400 per kilowatt year. And that's compared to the dashed line representing the average cost of a household battery, which is a little bit above $400 per kilowatt year. So again, just based on the limited number of benefits that we're looking at here and the cost data that we had for this specific analysis, we're finding that those benefits would fall short of the cost of the battery by about $63 per kilowatt year. Again, not the economics from the perspective of the customer, but the economics from the perspective of the power system. Then we move on to transmission scale storage. Here, what we've modeled is the energy value of the battery. So really using this battery that's connected to the transmission system to participate in the energy market. These batteries, actually all three of the battery types that we're analyzing also could participate in the FCAS market and provide ancillary services. We didn't include that benefit because it would effectively be the same on a dollars per kilowatt year basis for all three battery types. And there's also some uncertainty around the extent to which that future revenue opportunity is going to persist as more and more storage starts to come onto the system and compete to provide that service. So we just focused on energy value here. Couple takeaways. The first is the dashed blue line for transmission scale batteries is a lot lower than we're seeing for the household batteries. So basically what that means is in dollars per kilowatt year, a very large, 100,000 megawatt hour battery is cheaper than a household battery because you're able to take advantage of significant economies of scale. The other thing to note here is that in this case, we do see the benefits exceeding the cost. So the annual average energy value of this battery exceeds the installed cost of the battery. So there are net cost savings there. Then we move on to the third type of battery, which is where we start to get into this Goldilocks principle that Brian was describing. With community scale batteries, we have this. We analyze the same potential value streams that we analyze for household batteries. So we are considering the fact that they could provide energy value into the Australian energy market. They could provide local reliability value if they're configured to serve communities downstream in the case of a distribution outage. And then they also could provide distribution value if these batteries are sited in locations of the power system where there is an opportunity to defer an expensive distribution upgrade and operate it in a way that enables that distribution deferral. So that value stack is there. And then what you can see is the dashed line for community scale batteries is higher than for transmission scale batteries. So these are more expensive, but lower than for household batteries. The source of data that we use for our cost assumptions here for community scale batteries is NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the US. It's basically a government-funded research lab that does a lot of both bottom-up and top-down analysis of the cost of battery systems of different sizes and configurations that are being deployed in the US and globally, and develops kind of standardized estimates for the cost of these different batteries. We went with that data source because we wanted to use an internally consistent source of data on the cost of all three of these projects. And we also wanted to find a data source that had a forward-looking perspective, a forecast of how the cost of these different battery projects could evolve over time. I think what we've heard in some of the feedback and early feedback to this study is that the experience with community scale batteries to date in Australia has been that blue line that we're showing here is too low. And the projects have come in at a significantly higher cost than we're showing there. Which certainly is possible. There's definitely a lot to consider when we're talking about the cost of a battery, the duration of the battery, which costs are being included in terms of the battery pack versus the installed cost. But ultimately, I think what we're trying to represent here is a possible future scenario where the cost of community scale batteries is able to reflect some economies of scale that would result from a more mature industry in this regard. So that's a high level view on the economics that we analyzed. We do want to acknowledge that there are other benefits that could be considered in this analysis as well. So, we looked at energy value, the potential for avoiding investment in the distribution system, and local reliability value. I also mentioned that FCAS ancillary services is a value stream that any of these batteries potentially could provide. There's also the capacity incentive scheme. We haven't modeled that, but we do acknowledge that that is another potential source of value as well. Reduced solar curtailment, particularly specifically when we're talking about solar output that's being curtailed from distributed rooftop solar facilities. Household storage and community scale storage could be configured to avoid some of those curtailments that would be happening at the distribution system level, store that energy, and then discharge that energy at times when it has value to the system. Voltage support is a service that could be provided by household storage and community scale storage as well to address some voltage related concerns that could be introduced from increasing dependence on solar. And then lastly, we just wanted to acknowledge the potential for intrinsic customer value. There is a degree of benefit that individual households may receive from generating their own power, having control over that power, and also benefiting from the added resilience that would come from having a battery and rooftop solar located on site. So we do want to acknowledge that as a unique benefit of household storage as well. There is clearly a lot of uncertainty when it comes to any individual modeling assumption that we needed to make through this analysis. And we did want to reflect the impact of that on our conclusions. So we ran 10 different modeling sensitivity cases. We looked at different assumptions, both higher assumptions and lower assumptions related to energy value, basically the market prices that we're using to simulate the energy value of the batteries, the location of the batteries from which state they're located in, the value associated with local reliability and whether the battery even provides that value, the benefits associated with the ability to defer investment in the distribution system, and then ultimately that cost assumption, the cost of the battery itself. So we looked at 10 different cases for community batteries. What you can see is whereas our base case estimate was that the net benefit of these batteries was $87 per kilowatt year. As we play around with the different modeling assumptions, we see that net benefit could be higher or lower than we modeled in the base case. There's only one scenario where we were finding that the net benefits of the community batteries were negative, and that was when we looked at, I think over the past 6 years across 5 states within Australia, the single year when energy prices resulted in the lowest overall energy value for the battery. So there is definitely some sensitivity of these results to the battery's ability to monetize its value in the energy market. and we want to recognize that. Also, when we look at this chart, we do see more financial upside than downside risk, which we would, attribute to there being some real upside potential associated with extreme events or extreme weather years in terms of energy value. The value of local reliability, avoided distribution costs is very heavily location dependent. And then, again, going back to my earlier point, there currently is a high level of uncertainty in storage capital markets due to the high battery demand and constrained raw material pipelines. So how costs of these batteries evolve over time is going to be a really important factor in all of this analysis. So just to wrap up kind of what we're taking away from this quantitative analysis, we are seeing that there could be a number of advantages to community scale battery projects if we really optimize our approach to all of this and market conditions evolve in a way that favors community scale batteries. So relative to transmission scale batteries, advantages of community scale batteries are that they can defer distribution system capacity upgrades if they're deployed and located appropriately. They can provide local reliability if they're configured to serve downstream load during a distribution outage. And they also can increase solar PV hosting capacity by essentially absorbing some of that solar output, local solar output that otherwise would be curtailed. On the other side of the Goldilocks principle, relative to household batteries, community batteries could leverage diversity in household energy use profiles to provide similar benefits as household batteries, but at a lower total installed capacity. And I think that is an underappreciated but important benefit of community scale batteries. Not every customer's demand for electricity is peaking at exactly the same time. So you don't necessarily need to size a community scale battery at the same level of capacity to serve a given number of households than you do if you're sticking a battery behind the meter of every one of those homes individually. And then it's also the case that relative to household batteries, it may be possible, and we'll see if this plays out, but it may be possible for community scale batteries to take advantage of economies of scale to reduce the cost per unit of installed capacity as well. So those are the advantages, but we do want to recognize that there are challenges as well, right? So community scale batteries are more expensive than transmission scale batteries. They are more challenging to design and deliver than household batteries. There are additional distribution system configuration considerations that are important. They're a less mature product with a less established delivery chain. You have to be able to monetize across a value stack that's fragmented across multiple entities in order to realize all the benefits that we've modeled here. And then it also is the case that the benefits of any given community battery project will vary depending on where they're located. So given that there's opportunity, but also pretty significant challenges, we did want to reach out to stakeholders just to understand their view on the barriers to community scale battery deployment and what are some of the options for addressing those barriers. So several different questions related to barriers and options for overcoming the barriers. Talked to, I think, 10 or 11 different groups within Australia and got some really helpful perspective from people who are on the ground, really dealing with working through a lot of these issues and trying to make this happen. So I'll just take 2 minutes to conclude here, but I'll just summarize what we extracted from this is some of the what we consider to be the most attractive solutions for addressing some of the biggest barriers to fully optimizing the value of community scale batteries. And there are 3 areas that we identified. So the first is, and Brian mentioned these in his introductory comments, we need to reward the batteries for the value that they provide. Community scale batteries and consumer energy resources, or CERs more broadly, typically are not rewarded for the full comprehensive value that they could bring to the energy system. So some solutions here are, community scale batteries and CERs could be made able to participate in a capacity market or investment scheme. That's one clear opportunity for us. If that's being introduced, making sure that these resources that can provide that service are allowed to is a critical consideration here. And then the other consideration is we need to make sure that network tariffs reflect the time varying and location specific nature of the value that these resources could bring to the network. Second area has to do with locations and identifying the best locations. Many different locations within a given distribution network could benefit from storage, but there's not a lot of public data around where those specific locations are and what exactly is needed to avoid expensive investments in the distribution system in those locations. So recommendation that we have for allowing third-party developers of these projects to maximize that value is for distribution networks to publish data and maps that identify those locations in the network that would benefit the most from having a community scale storage project located on site, and even providing some guidance or some specifications around exactly what's needed from a configuration standpoint to provide those benefits. And then lastly, we have some commentary on building a local industry. Community scale storage, it's definitely still an emerging technology, has a less established delivery chain. So, high costs for designing and developing these projects, they can have a major impact on overall project economics. And this is what takes us back to that question of cost. And what is the cost of a community scale battery today, and what is it going to be in the future? Here we highlight the opportunity to use grant programs to build a local industry in each part of the supply chain so that we can start to deliver on some of the scale related potential benefits that could be achieved from deploying community scale batteries in Australia at a lower cost. So I think I've bumped up on my time, so I'm going to stop there and pass it back to Brian.
Oh, that was great, Ryan. Thank you. And so Marnie and Tristan, if you want to put your cameras on, we can invite you into discussion here. I'll briefly introduce both of you. So Marnie Shaw is a research leader in the battery storage and grid integration program at the Australian National University. I feel a little bit unworthy, really, of sort of facilitating this discussion on community scale storage, because that's kind of Marnie's gig. She is like the connector and leader of the band of married community storage advocates in Australia. And then Tristan Edis, he's a director of analysis and advisory at Green Energy Markets. He's also a pretty outspoken and well published commentator on the energy system in Australia. He does some of the modeling that IEMO uses on household batteries in the integrated system plan, and probably on and solar too, and maybe some other things. Okay, so maybe I'll give Ryan a chance to catch his breath and throw this one to both Marnie and Tristan. So Marnie, I'll go to you first. Do you agree with the barriers that Ryan identified, or that he highlighted in the report and just now in the talk?
Yeah, thanks, Brian, and thanks a lot, Ryan, for taking us through the work. It was really very clearly explained, and I really enjoyed that. So I guess I've got a couple of comments to make. And one, I'll start with the one where you're talking about rewarding batteries for the value they provide. And you said in your introductory remarks that, there's a couple of years have passed since you did this work. So one thing that has happened in the last couple of years, which I think is really fantastic for batteries moving forward, is a lot of work being done to look at trial tariffs, network tariffs that can appropriately pay batteries for the services they provide. So the network tariff is designed to pay an asset for the either cost or savings that they will bring to the network for the future. So if the battery is being operated in a way that does reduce future network costs, then the battery should be paid for that. And so what we've got is these new two-way tariffs that are being trialled, and they actually can pay the battery instead of having to pay a network cost like we all do in our houses. can actually pay the battery for that. So I mean, there's still work to be done in working out exactly how those payments, what those network tariffs should look like. I think that's a really positive thing that's happened in the last couple of years that I think goes some way to solving that problem that you highlighted around how do we pay batteries for the value they provide. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to say is I definitely agree with your highlighting that there's an issue on locating batteries in the right place. So we've done some extensive simulations of different kind of scenarios with neighborhood batteries. We use the CSIRO low voltage network topologies, so they're representative of all different Australian networks. And what we have seen is that sometimes the batteries help unlock network capacity, which is what we want from these batteries, and sometimes they don't. So it's and partly that's because some of our networks don't have any issues at the moment with network capacity. That would change in the future as we have, as you know, in Australia, we have a huge amount of rooftop solar and it's ever increasing. So that is an evolving, that will become more of an issue into the future. So that value will only increase, but for sure, we do need to do some work on finding tools that really help us identify the best locations for the batteries. There is work going on. We just heard a presentation this week from an Australian company called ZepBen, who's working with another company called GridCog. They've done work with funding from my state, ACT, government, to develop a map, like a constraint map that helps community battery developers identify spots where their battery is going to have the most impact. So that's about the location. And I just wanted to make one final very quick comment about the local industry, which I think is also an exciting opportunity. And one thing that I would love to see in the future is using Australian flow batteries for this scenario. So we have an Australian company, Redflow, that makes flow batteries, and really there's no reason why we have to have lithium ion for this kind of battery. It's just can be a big heavy thing sitting in a park. So I'd love to see Australian made flow batteries as future neighborhood batteries. I think that's enough from me. Thanks, Brian. Pass over to Tristan.
Yeah, Tristan, just quickly, everybody keep asking the questions in the Q&A. Also upvote them. That's the easiest way for me to tell what people actually want to get answered. Tristan, what do you reckon?
Yeah, look, the fundamental issue here is underpinning the idea of community batteries is this concept of there's this distribution network value. The batteries theoretically should be able to help us lower that cost, right? Because we can say utility scale, yep, clearly it's way cheaper than either residential / behind the meter, and it's cheaper than community scale. So you go, okay, well, utility scale is cheaper, but as Ryan's report outlines, there's this other additional value potentially that we could capture if we deploy batteries further down the chain, closer to customers. And then the question becomes, okay, do we do that through neighborhood, community scale / really network-owned batteries? Because the network is the gatekeeper of their own value unless you get the battery behind the meter, or do we do the behind the meter batteries? And a lot of the thinking behind why we should do community scale is, oh, well, they'll be bigger than a household battery, so therefore they'll be cheaper because we'll have economies of scale. Now, what's happened in practice is they're more expensive than behind the meter batteries. And we have several data points now for that. So we have the federal government's Community Batteries for Household Solar program rolled out grants for a very large number of batteries across a wide range of networks all around the country. And they were all pretty much coming in with a government grant. Now, in addition, the network's supposed to add extra money. The general cost of the government grant was $1,372 per kilowatt hour. Now, what is a behind the meter battery cost? Generally, it's between $900 and $1,300 a kilowatt hour. but that's including GST. We've got to deduct GST if we want to have a comparison that's valid against what the networks are paying, because they don't pay GST. So that's about roughly $820 a megawatt hour to $1,200 a kilowatt hour. That's the behind the meter battery. Okay, so the government grants from the federal government already substantially exceed what we can see as the market price for a fully installed behind the meter battery. Now, but there's also a network contribution that was supposed to have been made. And so I've gone and tried to find other examples there. Now, the worst case is United Energy with their pole top battery program. Like, God knows why they wanted to put an incredibly heavy battery up a pole, but that's what they chose to do. And it was $4,167 per kilowatt hour. Then we've got Powercor's Tarnoot battery. The Victorian government contribution was $12,000 a kilowatt hour, and Powercor was supposed to chip in some additional money for that. So that I have heard roughly around $3,000 a kilowatt hour. Energy Queensland's solar soak, as they call them, batteries, was $1,864 a kilowatt hour. So these are substantially more expensive than rolling out a behind the meter battery. Now, in terms of the value to the end consumer, the problem with network/community batteries is, how do we get that value from the network company to the end consumer? And it's not a default, but the network will just be benevolently passing that on to end consumers. And it's actually very hard to see we don't have very good documentation from these government programs about how that value, that benefit, is going to get passed through to end consumers, either through lower cost bills, improved reliability, or increased solar capacity. I'm not seeing quantification of it. The other problem is the politicians get involved. Now, what do? So this current program that's rolled these all out, the Labor Party announced this before they were in government, where they would go. Now, I know that wasn't based upon anything to do with the weaknesses in the network or needs for potential upgrades or voltage issues that were inhibiting the installation. It was a political decision about what would help them with getting votes in particular electorates. And so I look at all of that and I go, I actually think behind the meter, this is a distraction for us. And really, we need to be focusing on behind the meter, because this theory that networks will deliver a lower cost because they have better economies of scale, there are two problems with that. The first is networks are monopolies, and that means they're not disciplined by competition, and that means they're generally far less efficient than what we tend to see with essentially the solar industry in terms of rolling out solar and batteries. They're more cost efficient than networks are, because it's an incredibly competitive market. Then the second thing, though, is that network batteries or community batteries are a much more complex position from both a commercial perspective and a technical perspective. You need to include lots more people. You need to do lots more supporting work. Now, with a utility scale battery, you get to offset that over a very large battery. Whereas with networks, batteries, we're offsetting there's a lot of additional costs associated with coordinating and organizing that battery, which don't get offset over such a large size battery. And so that's sort of why I'm kind of skeptical about network/community batteries being a better option, because the value is hard to deliver to end consumers, or ensure it is delivered to end consumers, and the cost is not better, it's worse than household or behind the meter batteries.
Well, thanks for that, Tristan. I think it's really important and valuable contribution to this discussion. So I have some thoughts actually about ownership that ECA has shared, but maybe I'll pass to Ryan to I would like to hear your thoughts. I mean, I think some of this is just the installed cost, because you didn't look at who owned the battery, just the installed cost, and you weren't looking at today's cost, you were trying to look at the future. So, so how would you respond to Tristan's critiques?
Yeah, no, I mean, it does just, from my perspective, on the surface, it kind of, the concept that a bigger battery would cost more on a per unit basis than a smaller battery defies logic a bit. I mean, I understand kind of some of Tristan's commentary around there being additional costs associated with connecting these batteries to the distribution system, but I think it's hard to make these comparisons because to make an apples to apples comparison. And a couple of other, considerations that I would throw into the mix here are, if we are going after some of the distribution investment deferral benefits that a distributed resource can provide, if we really want to get a material impact from household batteries, then what that means is we can't just assume that a bunch of batteries located across behind the meter of homes across the entire country are going to be able to provide that battery. We need to have a lot of homes that are located in a very specific location of the distribution system adopting behind the meter batteries in order to provide that same distribution benefit that you potentially could get from a community battery that's located at that site. So one of the things we need to think about is, what is the cost that's associated not just with getting customers to adopt behind the meter batteries, but getting all of the customers in a very specific location to adopt batteries. The economics of that, the customer recruitment costs, even the feasibility, in my mind, are sort of just an important consideration here. And I don't have an answer as to whether that dramatically tips the scales one way or the other, but I think that behavioral aspect and the cost of doing that is one important thing here that's overlooked. And then the other thing I just want to go back to quickly is, as we mentioned in our presentation, there are benefits that you can get from using one battery to serve a number of homes due to the diversity in their load that you aren't able to take advantage of if you're using a bunch of individual batteries to serve a bunch of individual load profiles. Again, not saying that anything we've heard here so far is incorrect. It's just there are so many different considerations like this that go into is A higher or B higher type of comparison that there's a lot to untangle there.
Thanks for that, Ryan. I'm going to add a couple bits but then I'll pass to Marnie because I'm curious about your thoughts here. So I would agree, Tristan, with a lot of what you said about sort of the role of networks in providing these batteries. First and foremost, that point you made about basically what are the value that consumers are getting from the investments that networks are making with their money on these assets so far. I think there is really scant data and information about that. And I worry actually about the fact that we don't know why, the first 58 batteries, I mean, I don't actually care that much about that. But every battery after that, networks have been applying to put these batteries in particular locations, and they really should have very good rationales for doing so. And they've got all of the data that they ought to have all the data they need and the analysis capacity, to look at that data to figure out where the batteries should go. There's no good reason why they have that information and everybody else doesn't. So really, there should be a shared information. There should be good knowledge about ultimately did community batteries in those locations deliver long-term value to consumers. So I would agree with you, A, that value should be out there, and B, that I think over time, it's unlikely that you're going to see a 100-year-old regulated business be the most agile, innovative deliverer of new technology, which is required, I think, for community batteries to get off the ground. We do need innovative business models, and it's hard to see that DNSP is the best place to do that over time. I think in the short term, it makes sense to have them just to kind of build the technology, build some of the supply chain. And you can see ECA's comments around this that we made to ARENA and to the Australian Energy Regulator when they applied for a waiver, because the network's got a temporary waiver to put these batteries out. And so I think there is a question about whether or not that waiver is allowed to lapse, because ultimately, given the way that the market's structured here, maybe networks shouldn't be allowed to receive value from non-network value streams related to community batteries. Marnie.
I've got so many points to say, but I'll just keep it to a couple because I know we're running out of time. One thing, Tristan, that you mentioned and is about how do we pass on the benefits, the actual financial benefits to consumers. This is something that's also been discussed a lot in the last couple of years. Really, I think the key thing is that network batteries or any kind of battery storage, and there are a bunch of other technical solutions as well, are all focused on maximizing our use of the network. So increasing network capacity for our energy resources, for our solar and for EVs. So for me personally, I would love to have a battery storage solution in my neighborhood that allowed me to increase my solar export limit, which is currently to 5 kilowatts, and in other parts of Australia it's less than that, and many customers are reduced to 0 kilowatts for solar exports. So if the battery unlocked network capacity that allowed me to export, an extra 3 kilowatt hours per day, then that would, pay me something like $100 a year in extra solar feed-in tariff. So that's just one way that we can actually really pass on. But it's really all about bringing together all the solutions that we have. So battery storage, dynamic operating envelopes, everything is working together to maximize our network capacity so that we can have more and more rooftop solar, more electric vehicles, household electrification, and so on. So I think, like eyes on the prize, we have to focus on what we're trying to achieve, and that's about maximizing network capacity.
Great point, Marnie. All right, I'm going to open this up to some of the Q&A stuff. I guess we're woefully behind time. I think I know Ryan can stay a little bit later. I can stay a little bit later. Tristan and Marnie, if you're able to stay on, maybe we'll just go 15 minutes after. If everybody else has to drop off, that's okay. All right, so there's a question from Jan from PIAC here that I thought was pretty good, and it vaguely speaks to what Marnie just brought up. So he asks, could the panel speak to how we might bridge the gap between the community's aspirations and understanding of what a community battery can and should do, focused on the private benefit and storage as a service, and unlocking the distribution network value of these assets? Basically, focus more on a system benefits. So how do we actually get all of these benefits and provide value both to the distribution system and to individual consumers? And I would note here too, I think that's a great question, and it doesn't only have to apply to community batteries. Actually, every consumer energy resource can do both things. So we can answer the question from that perspective as well. Ryan?
No, I agree that it's a great question. It's something that I struggle with a bit because, I think the thesis of our study is that community scale batteries can provide grid services at a lower net cost, and so therefore reduce the overall cost of serving customers. And if that value can be passed through to customers, if there's a mechanism for that, then rates are lower and everyone wins. I think it's hard to communicate that to customers when they're looking at a battery that's sitting in their neighborhood and saying, what is this doing for me specifically, right? So kind of, the first thought that comes to mind is it's not easy, but some education around the way that battery is reducing the overall cost of serving their community and the network more broadly is one talking point. The other, and Marnie's better positioned to speak to this than me, but that point about network capacity and dynamic operating envelopes and improving your ability to do something with your locally sited solar, to me, that's a tangible benefit that could be communicated to those specific customers in that location.
Tristan, anything you'd add on this point? Behind the meter battery can do everything a community battery can do, because it's about simply remote controls, which we already have that capability to turn a battery on or off through remote software controls, and so they can deliver those sort of more broader benefits. So the thing is, a lot of people have this operating assumption that a behind the meter battery will only take care of self-consumption of that load, but There's no reason. At the moment, most solar systems that we install today in Australia export about 80% of their generation. It's not self-consumed. In fact, it's probably getting closer to 90% of the solar generation is exported. What I see happening with batteries as the incremental cost of battery cells comes down is the average battery now that people install is somewhere between 10 and 13 kilowatt hours. It'll be probably about 20 kilowatt hours in, I suspect, probably 2035. Most of that capacity will not be used by the household. It will be left unutilized by the time the sun comes back up and the solar is basically meeting their needs. What's going to end up happening is those batteries will be exporting power to the grid. And it's a matter of obviously creating the right incentives to encourage them to export at the right time, which generally will be ideally, between 4 and 9 p.m. But you don't need a particularly complex tariff structure to start encouraging that right behaviour, such that household behind the meter battery is actually supporting the overall network. But it comes down to a more fundamental issue here, which is batteries are a competitive service. They're not a natural monopoly. And so what we need is actually, if we really want to take advantage of this, we need to move towards a model, in my view, where the system operator is different to the network owner. And those people are sitting there going, oh, actually, you know what, voltage control is important, or peak demand, I want to contain the cost of servicing people's demand. I'm going to use other services besides just upgrading the network. And at the moment, we don't have that in Australia. We bundled the two when we privatised the networks and corporatised them. And as a result, we have to persuade the networks to do these sorts of things and sort of opening up another whole can of worms. But the reality is, with that, a behind-the-meter battery can do all the things that Marnie wants it to do, or that Ryan outlines as extra benefits that we have from a community battery, we can also get from a behind-the-meter battery.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. And I guess a couple of things I would just add here. One is, I think sometimes this debate can seem like it's community batteries against household batteries. It's not. We need both. It's also, there's a bunch of other solutions that are consumer solutions or non-network solutions that also can provide these values. Flexible demand, a hot water, flexible hot water service, EV charging that we're not talking about, that may be more cost effective than any kind of household or larger scale battery. So that's one thing to mention. I guess another thing I did, and then I was going to jump to Declan's question, but I wanted to ask you a question, Ryan. I guess my understanding of like the simplified way to explain why you did the analysis from a societal perspective rather than an individual consumer perspective is because we basically wanted to look at what the impact was for just the regular consumer that doesn't have solar, that doesn't have a household battery, that isn't really part of the community battery scheme, that's just there. And that is going to be, that's today a majority of Australian households and small businesses. Is that right? That's basically like the analysis basically shows what the net costs or benefits would be for that consumer.
Yeah, given that most consumers are non-participants, it is essentially a commentary on the economics for them. We also took this perspective because we didn't want to constrain the analysis by any sort of simplifications that exist in the tariffs today that don't fully reflect the potential benefits or costs of operating the batteries in a given way. So we really wanted to take a system cost-based perspective on the analysis for that reason as well.
Okay, great. So I can't wait on Declan's question anymore. I like it. It's a good question, but I asked people to upvote, and I'm not doing anything about clearly the most popular question. So he asks, how would broad adoption of vehicle to grid technology impact the value offered by community batteries? For the floor. Does anybody rank?
I've been doing too much talking. I'll just give a really quick response to that, which is, this is a question that comes up broadly in the US as well. Like when you look at the amount of storage capacity that could exist in the form of electric vehicles on the grid in the next 10 years, at least in the US, it would be like an order of magnitude larger than the amount of utility scale storage or grid connected storage that we're expecting to have on the system. So just that technical potential is enormous. And if we find a way to use those batteries as grid resources, it could have a major impact on our need for other forms of storage. The big question is behavioral, and that is customers are buying electric vehicles because they want a car, not because they want to buy a grid resource. And so to what extent will we be able to get customers to trust the program operator and to give up some control of their EV charging to allow it to provide those services to the grid? I think the potential is there because we have a lot of customers who volunteer to sign up for demand response programs, but we don't yet have a firm, solid answer to that behavioral question.
Yeah, Marnie.
Yeah, I would add, so yeah, it's such a fantastic and exciting potential enormous storage resource coming to us. One thing is that there's a lot of uncertainty in the future about exactly how that will change our future network demand. So I see storage like neighborhood batteries as a way for us, like an insurance mechanism for us to make sure that we can manage those future network peaks. That's what drives network costs that come to us in our bills. So we want to make sure we don't get any peaks. Like here in the ACT, we're expecting peaks in the middle of the day. So, and actually we don't know when the peak is going to be. So it's about this insurance mechanism so we can mitigate those future network demand peaks and make sure that we're not all left with huge costs from unknown ways that people are going to plug in their cars.
Yeah, I'm sort of tempted to ask a question here. I'm not sure that anyone really wants to answer this question, but about public EV charging, right? So this question is about vehicle grid, and lots of people will be able to charge their vehicles at home, but not everyone. Not everyone has off-street parking, and so you're going to have to use some people will have to use public charging, and there's an open question about who ought to own that. I actually think it's vaguely related and germane to the discussion we've already been having about community battery ownership. If you look at the history of the electricity industry, AGL, Australian Gas and Light, originally sold gas street lighting. At a certain point, replaced that with electric street lighting. Most networks and utilities in the US, but networks here still have an electric lighting service. It's like historically a monopoly service that they provided that now can be privately provided, but there's basically like a network option and a public option and a private option. And you can go with whichever version you want to. That's kind of what's happening with community batteries. I'm not sure it's quite an apples to apples thing because I'm not sure there's the same value that consumers see from community batteries as they do from street lighting. Anyway, what about networks owning public vehicle charging stations? Any thoughts about that?
I have a strong view, and I'm happy to respond on it. So at the moment, the way that we're rolling out, so let's put aside DC fast charging. Let's just talk about most people could get by with a slow charger of some kind. Something akin to your standard wall socket is enough for most households to get by for their daily commute. At the moment, we're rolling out these slow chargers via these ad hoc government grant programs, and they're rolling them out at $10,000 a pop, these chargers. I wrote about this in the fin review the other week. It just doesn't work economically. Once we move to scale rollout of substantial numbers of people owning EVs in areas that are like inner urban areas of many cities in Australia where we don't have off-street parking, we need to find a way to roll out street chargers, slow street chargers, at way less than what it's costing at the moment. And the only way to do that is to do it at scale and coordination. So right, this street, we're going to blanket that street with several chargers so that we get enough scale that then we can get competitive tenders where we can bring the unit cost of those charges down to a reasonable price. One option is you just gift it to the networks and you say, networks, you're the monopoly, like Victoria did with their metering, and in the end we'll get charged like wounded bulls because we haven't done it in a proper competitive way, and those networks will snow the regulator. The way we should do it is governments should go in and say, right, okay, we're going to appoint 3 suppliers. You suppliers we're going to have a much larger pool. We want to roll out. Here's what we're going to roll out. You tell us what your cost is going to be if we give you a given geographic area. See how you go. If you try and muck us around, then we'll go to the other two suppliers and we'll start giving them more work than we do to you. And so don't try and muck us around and come up with reasons for why it costs you more than what you said in your tender. And then we'll end up with a set of infrastructure. Then the issue is, okay, how do we recover the cost of that from consumers? And at that point, we may then say, okay, now we will hand it to the network operators to then recover the cost, or we'll recover the cost separately through some kind of other distribution charge of some kind, but we won't do it through the networks. But you don't have to use a monopoly. You can do it through a competitive process, the rollout of that charging infrastructure. But ultimately, it has to be a regulated service, because imagine you're sitting there and you just happen to be in the bad luck street where a private sector operator goes, I know these guys, and it would be a pain in the neck for them to go charge their car further down the road. I will just hike the charge and hike the charge and hike the charge. You have to have a regulated service because of the fact that people are constrained in their choice about, and it will be an essential service as well.
Yeah, right on. It is an essential service. I agree with that. So maybe I'm going to slightly amend the question because we're running on time here. So feel free to answer this question or give any insight you might have to it. Also, since Tristan just gave a plug for something he recently wrote, a plug, if you want to, for any recent research or relatively recent, something you think that would be good, that you're aware of or that you've done for the audience. Marnie.
Can I start with the plug?
Yeah, sure.
We've just finished 2 reports that we wrote with funding from Energy Consumers Australia. So one is about trying to assess how much neighbourhood batteries can unlock this network capacity that we're focused on. Future work should really include dynamic operating envelopes into that, so we can really find out like maximally what can we achieve with this sort of solution. And the second one is a comparison of the new trial network tariffs for neighbourhood batteries. So those 2 reports, and they'll be made public in the coming weeks. Thanks,
Marty. I wasn't looking for the ECA associated.
You set that up really well, Brian. That was
but I gave you the softball. You hit it out of the park. Ryan,
I'll just make a quick plug. Yeah. Just today we released a study for those who are interested in what's happening in the States. A study looking at the market potential for virtual power plants in California over the next decade. And this is coming right at a time when the California state government is starting to debate policy that would essentially establish a renewable portfolio standard for virtual power plants and require that utilities meet a certain portion of their peak demand through VPP capacity. And just Tristan will like to hear this. The biggest single resource in the virtual power plant that we modeled is behind the meter batteries. So that is playing a big role in the study, and we do see there being a lot of potential there as well.
So there's a lot of great questions in the chat. I think we answered some of them. Some of them are sort of comments. There are some that I don't know that we'll answer. They're great questions. Stephen Pritchard had a number of them. He asked this question here about there's already roughly 250,000 household batteries. Like they've got a head start. Will community batteries ever catch up? Doesn't matter. We need all of we need the cheapest resources, which will be a combination of both, I would say, just to answer that. I'm going to give a quick plug but before I do that, thank you so much to Ryan, Marnie, Tristan, for being good sports. Thanks everybody for listening. Thanks again. Talk to y'all later.